Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to FIU's Global Learning's New York Times discussion with Christopher Flavelle, Miami on the front lines of climate change. I'm Hilary Landorf, Executive Director of the Office of Global Learning Initiatives and a Professor of International and Intercultural Education at FIU. For those of you who are familiar with our university-wide Global Learning Initiative, thanks for supporting what we do. For those who are not familiar with Global Learning, let me tell you, we help everyone in the FIU community increase their ability to understand interconnections between global and local events, analyze issues from multiple perspectives, and take action to make the world a better place. We do this by offering over 240 courses throughout the undergraduate curriculum in which our diverse students collaborate to analyze and solve local and global problems. We also offer events like this one in sponsorship with the New York Times, Academic Affairs, and the libraries, in which speakers engage us in discussions about pressing issues of our time and inspire us to become part of the development of solutions. To find out more about global learning and how you can become involved in globally themed clubs, earn a global learning medallion, or participate in other globally focused events, look us up on the web at goglobal.fiu.edu or follow us on Twitter. To this afternoon's event, I have the honor of introducing you to our speaker, Christopher Flavelle. Christopher has been a reporter for the New York Times since 2019. He focuses on how people, governments, and industries try to cope with the effects of global warming. He has written about how climate change has sweeping consequences for finance, insurance, real estate, utilities, transportation, and other industries. He received a 2018 National Press Foundation Award for coverage of the federal government's struggles in dealing with flooding. Born and raised in Toronto, bachelor's degree in political science from McGill University and a master's in international affairs from Columbia University. Christopher is a true global learner. For global learning is not a thing to be achieved, but a continual learning process. To illustrate Christopher's lifelong global learning, I want to tell you a quick story that I read about him. In 2003, a year after graduating from McGill, Christopher went to one of the new states that had broken from the former Soviet Union, Kyrgyzstan. He was looking for adventure and a business opportunity, along with the many NGOs, governments, and expatriates who had flooded the capital, Bishkek, at that time. So what did Christopher do? He opened a bar, the American Pub, and ran it for 4 days until a tax collector came into the bar and gave him an ultimatum: either hire the man's niece as a waitress or get shut down. When this tax collector left the bar, Christopher said to his business partner, "This man was trying to blackmail us. We got to call the police on him." To which his partner said, "Chris, this guy is the police." Christopher didn't shut down the bar, and he didn't hire the man's niece either. He eventually paid a high price for his actions, gave up the bar, and went back home. You can find the full story of Christopher's global learning process and experience in an article he himself wrote about it while he was a reporter for Slate magazine. And with that, please give Christopher a warm welcome.
Thank you for the introduction. That's I haven't heard that story forever. Great to be with everyone. My name is Christopher Flavelle. I'm a climate reporter at the New York Times, and I write about what people sometimes call climate adaptation or climate resilience. And again, that's how people, governments, and industries try to prepare for and respond to the effects of climate change. It's obviously an important question in South Florida, which is facing the effects of climate change in many ways sooner than other parts of the country. I'm going to talk about some of the lessons so far based on my reporting from Miami and other parts of South Florida, and what those seem to mean for the rest of the US. The physical changes from climate change seem to be pretty well understood at this point. It's sea level rise, sunny day flooding. It's a general tendency toward more intense rainstorms and hurricanes. I'm not going to be focusing in this talk on those physical changes, and I'm not going to focus on the drivers of rising greenhouse gas emissions or how to reduce those emissions. I've got great colleagues at the New York Times climate team who focus on that, and I very much encourage you to go check out their stuff. I'm going to focus instead on the economic and social and policy challenges that come up as a result of those physical changes from climate change. I'm going to focus on two things. First, I want to talk about how climate change is beginning to affect other parts of life in South Florida, so the housing market, insurance, and infrastructure. And then second, I want to briefly talk about some of the questions raised by those social and economic effects. For example, what do cities owe their less wealthy residents as climate change gets worse? What does the rest of the country owe places like Miami on the front lines of climate change? And how should governments decide which communities most deserve protecting in the face of climate change? I'm not going to offer answers to those questions as a reporter. It's not what I do, and it wouldn't be appropriate. My job really just to lay out some of the takeaways from my reporting and specifically talk about the fault lines, economic and social, that are already being revealed by climate change in South Florida and what those mean for the rest of the country. So I want to start by talking about housing, because outside of the effects of a specific disaster, housing is probably where climate change will have the biggest effect on people's lives. It's also an area where governments are already facing some really tough challenges, and those will probably even get more difficult. If you've read about climate change in Miami, you've probably heard the phrase climate gentrification. That phrase usually refers to wealthier people who live along the coast, displacing lower income people on higher ground back from the coast because the premium attached to living further from the water is growing. And so the land that is away from the water and is higher up gets more desirable over time because of climate change. It's a Miami story because the first data I saw that showed climate gentrification was happening was research done in and around Miami. It was research by a professor named Jesse Keenan, who's now at Tulane. He found that since 2000, the value of single family homes in Miami-Dade County had increased faster for properties on higher land, even after controlling for size and age. That research came out in 2018. They found growing demand in places like Overtown, Little Haiti. And the concern is that over time, white and wealthy residents will push poorer and minority residents out of those neighborhoods and destroy the fabric of those communities. But the collision between climate change, wealth, and where people live is more complicated than just that one phenomenon. Something else that's happening that I want to just discuss for a moment: every time a storm damages or destroys a home anywhere in the country, in general, that home is supposed to get repaired or rebuilt so that it meets the current building code requirements. The grandfathering that applied goes away. That in South Florida, that usually means elevating your ground floor even higher off the ground or off the ground at all, using stronger materials, tougher windows, better roofs that are less likely to come off during a hurricane. On its face, that's all probably good news. Advances in science and construction mean that building codes generally get better over time. And if you rebuild the new code, then whoever lives in that home will be better protected against the next storm or flood or whatever disaster might happen. But more resilient homes also tend to be more expensive than the ones they replace. It's especially true if you live in a mobile home or something that was built a long time ago. Maybe it's on the ground. So there's a trade-off between safety and affordability. And it's one of sort of the core tensions as climate change gets worse. There's a third challenge, and that's insurance. And the cost of wind coverage in South Florida keeps going up. The cost of flood insurance in South Florida keeps going up. I've talked to people in the Keys who say that their combined home insurance costs for property, wind, and flood are approaching or exceeding $10,000 a year. That's a lot of money for anyone. But if you're on a fixed income or if you're middle class, then at some point, those costs alone could force you to move. So just to recap, if you're working class or middle income in South Florida, you're facing already 3 financial challenges from climate change. Tougher building codes that reduce the stock of affordable housing near the water, rising insurance costs that make it more expensive to live in the affordable housing that still exists, and then rising demands that's making it more expensive to live on higher ground away from the water. All 3 of those dynamics are coming up in other parts of the country, or they're going to, and they all push in the same general direction, which is that communities on or near the coast become even more homogenous, and working class or middle class families have a harder time finding places to live. I raise all that because it forces the question that I think the US is only starting to engage with, which is, as a society, are we willing to accept the idea of climate change making it harder for people who have less money to live by the water? And does that shift towards more homogeneous communities conflict with our notion of what constitutes a healthy and vibrant and diverse community? And then the next question, because all I got here is questions, what are we willing to do to stop that from happening if we decide that it doesn't fit the values that we believe in? For example, are we willing to pay higher taxes? And if so, how much higher and for how long? Now, I want to stress those are not just hypothetical questions. There's a lot that governments can do to reduce a community's exposure to climate change, at least in the short term or medium term. You can build seawalls, you can construct dunes, you can plant mangroves to blunt the force of storm surges, you can elevate roads so they don't flood as often, you can install pumps to get rid of the water once it's on your roads, you can give people subsidies to elevate their homes, which is usually fantastically expensive. And even if you can't reduce the risk, you can also shield people from the full cost of their insurance by holding down the rates they pay through NFIP for flood insurance, or Citizens if you're in Florida for wind insurance. The advantage of those solutions is they ease the financial pressure on households that we just talked about. The problem is probably obvious. They tend to cost a lot of money and they get more expensive over time. So cities and counties, generally, in my experience, will focus on the most vulnerable neighborhoods. Those expensive projects, they'll say, we can't do everywhere, where do we start? But it's not quite as easy as that, because vulnerable can mean 2 very different things in common language: physically vulnerable to the effects of climate change, but also socially and economically vulnerable. So people who would have the hardest time recovering economically from some sort of disaster. And the places that are physically vulnerable are not always the same places as the ones that are economically vulnerable. So you've got to choose, and your choice matters. And that's not just a Florida problem. In Texas, Harris County, which includes Houston, started a program 2 years ago that gave extra weight to low-income and minority neighborhoods for flood control projects. The idea was very welcome among advocates for those areas. It was hugely controversial more widely because whiter and wealthier neighborhoods felt they were being pushed to the back of the line. So if you're an official at the city or county level, you're trying to cope with climate change, and you're trying to decide where to spend scarce adaptation money first, you've got to figure out how you define vulnerability. And that probably means upsetting whoever isn't getting prioritized as a result of that choice. And we haven't even gotten to the hard part, right? At some point with climate change, it won't be enough for governments just to decide who to help first. They'll have to start thinking about which places aren't worth saving at all. And I realize how harsh that sounds, but let me tell you what that means in practice. It brings up the question of infrastructure. And infrastructure, I think, can sound inherently boring, and sometimes it is. But when it comes to climate change, it becomes kind of a proxy debate over which places should be saved from climate change. Roads are the most obvious example. About a year ago, the Times wrote about an effort in the Florida Keys to figure out which roads would have to be elevated and how much, so they wouldn't go underwater from sea level rise at different points in time. County officials looked at how much they'd have to elevate a single 3-mile stretch of road on one island to keep it dry year round. they calculated it would cost 75 million for 2025, 128 million for 2045, and by 2060 it would cost 181 million. You'd have to raise it higher and higher. And here's the kicker: the road only has 24 homes. Now there's 300 miles of roads in Monroe County, the Florida Keys. So you start to realize there probably isn't enough money to raise every road. And by probably, I mean almost certainly, because the tax base can't support it. So once you know there won't be enough money to do everything, then a pretty sound approach is to say, let's at least avoid putting money into areas that will probably be underwater anyway in 20 years, 30 years, before the asset you're thinking about spending money on is done. So which areas do you write off? And more importantly, how do you decide? What's a reasonable criteria? And of course, the answer is no one knows. It's still being debated. And now we get to the question of what people in the rest of the country feel like they owe to places like South Florida, because the federal government pays a huge share of infrastructure in general around the country, and climate resilience work in particular. It's because the cost of projects is usually beyond what state and local governments can pay on their own. So for the moment, there's a bit of a fix, which is cities and counties can go to the federal government and say, help us pay for these new costs in addition to regular infrastructure costs. And sure enough, the federal government is spending more and more money on those projects, and probably federal spending will keep going up as the need grows. But as those costs go up, you get to this really intriguing and, of course, difficult question, which is how much money will taxpayers from other parts of the country be willing to spend to protect South Florida and other high-risk coastal areas from climate change? If you're in New York, or if you're in New Orleans, or coastal Georgia, or places that are going to face these same problems, maybe you're willing to help Florida because you figure at some point Congress will help you. But there are parts of the country that don't anticipate having these same problems, certainly not from sea level rise or other kinds of climate problems. And so it's a fair question, at least, to ask whether at some point they'll say, maybe we don't want to be on the hook for these expensive projects that we won't benefit from. And again, there's no right answer. It's even hard to know how to begin to answer that question. But I think as a journalist, and I think as policy planners too, we think, what happens if or when the rest of the country begins to say no to these costs? So we get to the next point, which is you're already seeing some city governments in South Florida, like Miami and Key Biscayne and Miami Beach, issuing hundreds of billions of dollars in bonds to pay for climate resilience work. And that's maybe more notable than it sounds, that it says that these jurisdictions are willing to tax their own residents to pay the cost of this work and not just rely on the federal government. Then you get into a question of what's the ultimate capability? To what degree can even, I mean, Miami Beach is a great example, right? Very high income, high property value, compact area. So you don't have a huge amount of land to protect. But even then, how much can you protect that land with local spending alone? And for how long? And again, you're seeing a theme here. No one knows. The thing that I want to just note is the time scale of these problems, like anything in climate change, is among the hardest things to predict, right? As a general rule, Congress will still come up with as much money as it takes to help places recover after disaster. So there's still that sort of sense of camaraderie and common cause in the face of physical challenges. But if you're talking about a slow motion disaster like sea level rise, no one really knows yet if that same general principle will apply. No one knows whether Congress will say, yes, we should support raising roads in this part of Florida, even if the cost grows. So that brings us finally to the question of what people in climate land call managed retreats. And that's the idea of helping people leave vulnerable areas in an organized and safe way. The idea here is places that go underwater, people can leave anyway, unless something amazing happens technologically. And so how can you make it sort of as equitable and fair and efficient and safe as possible? You could imagine a point where the federal government says, we owe it to Americans anywhere in the country to deal with the effects of climate change. Sort of the unstated premise right now, but they could say it explicitly. But maybe Congress also says at some point, dealing with the effects of climate change does not necessarily mean living in the same place you've always lived. Maybe it means the federal government offers you money to move, and you take that money, great. And if you don't, you're on your own. I'm not saying that to predict that'll happen, but it's not hard to imagine it might be under consideration. Federal agencies already, the ones that work on climate resilience, have put more emphasis on helping people leave vulnerable areas and not just automatically building back in place. It's still the minority of the cases. There's still clearly, unsurprisingly, a bias towards building back in place. But FEMA and HUD and the Corps of Engineers are shifting a little more towards saying maybe that's not the right approach, because if people build back in place, the spending will continue. But manage and treat remains controversial, again, for obvious reasons. People are often, not always, but often reluctant to give up their community, especially when their community is as lovely as South Florida or other places that are on the front lines of climate change. So again, I hope the theme is clear here. These are tough questions. There's no right answer. I certainly have no idea what the right answer is. And I think that we're only beginning to ask these questions, let alone answer them. But what's interesting in the part of climate change I write about is what had seemed very far into the future, even 5 years ago, now seems like a problem for today, or if not for today, then for the near future. And so I think you're seeing state, local, and federal officials all behind closed doors mostly, but beginning to say to themselves, and we can't keep doing what we're doing now forever, and what's going to change and what counts as fair. And that's probably the toughest question. If this were all an engineering issue, you could find answers, right? You could find ways to keep people safe. But when you introduce, as you should, questions of equity, then how do you get solutions that are safe and affordable, and that feel like people have been treated in an equitable way? And that seems to be where the next big debate is. I think that the debate over whether climate change is happening, I think, is effectively over. The debate over whether it's happening fast enough to be an urgent problem, I think, is over. The debate over whether it's man-made is over. I think, the big debates are going to be not just how you cut emissions quickly, but given that we can't cut them fast enough to protect everyone from these effects, how do you make decisions now that will shield people from what's already happening and already baked in, even as you try to cut emissions? And that's certainly the questions that I'll be focusing on, and my team is focusing on. And I'd love to take questions from anyone in the audience, and thank you for having me here today.
Well, thank you so much, Christopher. You asked so many important questions about climate change, really. Now it's our turn to ask you some questions, some of which you can hopefully answer for us. And please, participants, feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to start with a question, which is the following. In your opinion, what's the #1 reason people don't understand the scope and reality of climate change? And attached to this, how can individuals that are connecting the dots influence others?
I've heard compelling evidence that there's lots of reasons why people continue to reject the science of climate change. This is not my focus, so I'm just sort of awkwardly regurgitating what I've heard from others. But my sense is it's some mix of people do a poor job of attaching the right value and weight to future risks. They heavily discount future risks, and if appropriately weighting future risks means you got to change something in your life you don't want to change, you'll be motivated to undercount future risk. And that's not a new problem. It's not a climate change problem. It's a problem that hits climate change pretty hard. And another problem probably is that people with some merits see climate change as a problem that will hit others more than it hits them. So there's probably a degree of selfishness involved, which is why should I, to what degree should I change my lifestyle to save somebody else? I think that's increasingly misguided. I think people don't realize the degree to which climate change will hit them, if not tomorrow, then in a few years. But it's definitely, my sense is that from the data I've seen, that's fading. At least in the US, there's more widespread acceptance of what's going on, how serious it is. As to how you convince others, I mean, look, if someone can ask that question, they'll be very successful in life. I don't know what the answer is. I limit my job to how do I make sure people know what's true, and lead the persuasion to others.
Yeah, that seems wise. A question has come in. How can the average person get involved in climate resilience work at the local level?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, a lot of it is local, and I think local politics tends to be the place where any one voter can have sort of the most impact. So my suggestion would be go and talk to your local officials, your city councilors or your representatives, and just see what they are planning. Just, do what a reporter is, ask questions. Just say, hey, what are you spending on infrastructure this year? And how are you incorporating climate effects in those decisions? And are you already, and this is a question I ask to local officials around the country, are you already deciding or talking about which areas to exclude from new spending because you think their risk is too high? And those are things that everybody should ask their local officials, and officials should be willing to talk about. They might not want to, but they should be willing to. So I think just find out who decision makers are where you live and ask them what they're doing about this, and make sure that whatever's happening is a debate you're involved in, because you're
Yeah. Yep. A little bit related, can you talk to us a little more about flood insurance's relationship with FEMA and why in South Florida we're still building in at-risk areas?
Yeah, so FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, runs the National Flood Insurance Program, which is the program that provides virtually all, not quite all, but almost all of the country's flood policies. And so FEMA sets the rates on those policies. They also, in theory, in reality, they enforce floodplain management rules, but those rules aren't terribly restrictive. Communities can build in the floodplain, but they got to be above what's called base flood elevation, the expected flood of 100-year flood. So there's certainly been push to get FEMA to demand more aggressive floodplain management rules from communities that get flood insurance. That's a tough one though, because if you're in a place like South Florida where big chunks of land are in the floodplain, for FEMA to say something along the lines of stop building the floodplain, it would have a pretty dire effect on these communities. So I can't predict the future any more than anybody else can. I sure would be surprised if FEMA adopted a posture that was that aggressive. So I think probably what's going to happen is you'll have more pressure on FEMA to at least be a little more strict about what it allows in communities that get flood insurance. But the pushback is immense. So it's one of those topics that we should all watch.
Absolutely. Another question here. Have you faced any resistance from the local leadership while raising this question of equity in your investigations?
Yeah, I mean, in general, my read on it from reporting it is most communities are still at the phase of just thinking through what the issues are. I mean, so I mentioned the story, I did the story on Houston last year, and in Houston, there was pushback from officials to this idea that you should attach extra weight to communities that are socially vulnerable because they're minority or low income. I don't know. I think probably the pushback, and I'm sure there will be pushback, is going to come down the road. I think what will happen first is you'll get pressure to incorporate some of these equity concerns into infrastructure decisions. And then as those equity concerns are incorporated, the pushback probably comes in response to that. when the groups that expect to get that money on the basis of higher property values or whatever else, if they come to feel that they are losing the privilege they had until then, that's, I think, the point where the pushback arrives. I haven't seen a lot of it. My sense at a very high level is that for the most part, local officials are still acting in good faith, and they are trying to say, what can we do that is fair and that works? And I think only once they start choosing tangible options, which generally isn't happening yet, then the people who feel like they've been hurt by that will start to push back.
Well, a lot of interest in this area. And another question along these lines of how far along is the movement in states and communities in reclaiming land that should not be built on because it's subject to water rise and flooding? And can you say who is leading in this area?
I mean, so if that means reclaim in the sense of undeveloped, there is, Blue Acres is a great example. It's a New Jersey program. It got a lot of money after Hurricane Sandy, and they try to buy out homes that have been hit by floods. And the goal is to buy out contiguous plots of land and revert that land to marshes that can then blunt the impact of flooding from rain events or from storm surge. And it seems to be, I mean, it's a bit early to say if it's working. I've been to some of these communities, and there are areas where just visually it seems successful because you've got big chunks of land. Other areas where it doesn't seem like it's working because you've got individual houses that are getting in the way of there being, rejuvenated marshes. But I think in any part of the country that's had significant flooding, the officials who deal with FEMA and HUD grants for buyouts, they're beginning to say, how can I use this money more intelligently? And this notion of green infrastructure as sort of using nature to better protect against the effects of climate change, I don't see it being especially controversial. I think the issue is it's expensive, right? Number one. Number two, you've got to make sure that you've got homeowners who are willing, the ones who live in the homes that would be undeveloped, make sure that they're okay with it. And it's hard to find communities where you have anything approaching unanimous consent for that. I think the next question could be, at what point do government officials start looking at eminent domain to push people out? Because if you've got 90% of community that wants to do it, 10% doesn't, that's so hard, right? Usually that just ends it, but maybe you proceed. Eminent domain is a very touchy subject among local officials, and that might change.
Right. You said the debate about climate change science and other aspects is over. Nonetheless, as you know, the debate is not over politically in Florida. The citizens of Florida voted in favor of a political party that continues to deny the science of climate change. Can you comment on the politics of climate change in Florida?
I'd be out of my mind to wait to pretend to offer any wisdom on Florida politics. The only thing I'd say is I don't want to get the impression, I think that everyone agrees at this point that climate change is real and man-made, but I think that it's no longer really a live debate. I think you've got segments of the population and segments of U.S. politics where people are continuing to express doubt. I think those segments are shrinking, and I don't think they're really. I think we can all tell the direction this is going. I think there isn't going to be a lot of life in that debate for long. It's a prediction that could totally be wrong, but my sense is moving elsewhere. Like, what do we do about it?
Well, that's a positive take, and we appreciate it. So another question in that light. Hi, Christopher. What are some ways we can demonstrate climate resilience, ideas of sustainability as an opportunity? I have found communicating positively is a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, there is an analogy here to be drawn with the Biden administration, which has really presented their climate agenda in the context of we can get good union jobs by pursuing lower emissions and climate action, and there's some truth to that, and there's some truth to the idea that pursuing resilience, likewise, can be understood in the context of opportunity. It's not obvious to me that on balance, resilience activities are going to be an economic boon. I think at some point, like any infrastructure spending is going to be a boon in that you've got to hire people to do the work, right? But I think that isn't the main thing. I think the fairness questions will be more important. I think it's sort of a no-brainer to build a seawall when you got to build a seawall or a levee or a dike. The issue is, what do you do with homes that shouldn't be there, and what do you do where there's a clear trade-off, again, safety versus affordability, right? So there is opportunity, and I get it. I see why officials stress the opportunity part of this, whether it's cutting emissions or resilience. But I think I worry sometimes that downplays the inherent difficulty in taking these steps. And I think it would be misleading to present any of these agenda items as, just a sheer win. I think easy stuff, great, but the easy stuff will not be all of it.
Yeah. Turning to another area here of climate change, there's a question: why was it so important for the U.S. to rejoin the Paris Agreement?
Yeah, I mean, look, my colleagues have done a great job writing about this. This is not my focus, but my understanding of the argument in favor of rejoining Paris, or the argument for why it mattered, is that it is, and I think the president has said this, it's meant to send a signal to other countries that the U.S. is taking it seriously and reinsert global leadership. From the corner of climate change that I focus on, that isn't terribly important. So I should leave that to others. But the argument, as I understand it, is that there's a question of signaling to the rest of the world that the U.S. is, again, making this a priority.
Right. Another question: can you talk about cutting-edge carbon renewal techniques we started seeing recently, and what can we expect in this area in the next few years? Do these carbon renewal techniques take away from concerted efforts to simply reduce emissions?
So the specific phrase carbon renewal is not one I'm familiar with. It could mean different things. People talk about regenerative agriculture as one way to cut emissions. I've written about strategies to pull emissions out of the atmosphere once they've been released. And assuming, so the general category of negative emissions, if that question refers to negative emissions, the argument that's been made to me on this is we are not going to stick to our carbon budget. The amount of emissions we can safely release at this point, without going to a dangerous degree of warming, we can't stay within that budget under any reasonable scenario, right? So the question is, well, how do you probably then have to look at also finding ways to pull emissions that are already in the atmosphere. I wrote on this a month or two ago. I think it sounds plausible to me. I don't think it's normative. I think descriptively it's true, which is descriptively it's not clear to me how the numbers add up to stay under 1.5 degrees if you don't at least look at negative emissions. Whether it's a good idea is a separate question. And I've written on that, others have written on that, and there's no answer that people agree on.
Yeah. Are there any actions taken from the former administration that cannot be walked back in terms of not combating climate change?
Again, I think I'd have to toss this one to my colleagues who focus on emissions. On resilience, I think the Trump administration actually did a lot of stuff on resilience. There are two new programs, one at FEMA called BRIC and one at HUD called the mitigation program. And they both entail lots of new money for climate resilience spending. The Trump administration didn't frame these as climate programs, but they are climate programs. And I think there was certainly action that climate experts welcomed from the Trump administration. Whether they did stuff on emissions that is irreversible, I really, I could guess, but I'm not the subject matter expert on it. So I would leave that to my colleagues.
Mhm. Good. Climate change can be a depressing topic. What keeps you going?
It is depressing. There's no question about it. I'd read, like, it'd be crazy to argue otherwise. I guess, I guess I'm not working in climate change. I'm working in journalism, and I feel like there's something inherently hopeful about sharing information and telling people what's going on. And hopefully at some point, if people are making decisions that don't reflect what they want and you get information, they make decisions that are different, that better reflect what they want. And what those decisions are up to voters and their representatives. But I feel like whatever the issue is, you're always helping by getting more information to people and hopefully helping them understand that information. So I draw my optimism from the idea that nothing is over, nothing is irreversible. Ultimately, that's not true. Something's irreversible. Nothing's hopeless. And so I think by getting more information to people, they can maybe make decisions that better reflect what they want, and that's as high as I'm aiming.
Right. So a question that gets to that. How high you're aiming. What do you think has been your most impactful climate change article?
Yeah, I wish I knew. I find that hard to measure. If someone knows how to answer that question, I'm all ears. I feel like my only goal is to write stories that feel important, and hopefully it'll change the way people look at issues. I wish I had a story to share. I wrote the story and this thing happened. The connection isn't usually that solid. I think as a body, I feel good about drawing attention to the issues of managed retreat and other resilience and adaptation equity issues. And hopefully over time, those change, those help inform people who are voters or making decisions. I wrote a story 2 years ago about how in Canada, places that get flooded are starting to say, people, don't build back, just don't build back, just move. And I've spoken to US local officials who said they read that story. I thought, hey, like, maybe we should look at that too. So it's nice when you feel like you can maybe help expand the range of options that decision makers are aware of. But whether you need to change in mind, I never know.
Right. So one more sort of personal question, and then we're going to get back to the specifics. How did you end up reporting on climate change as opposed to any other topic, and what keeps you coming back to it?
Yeah, I was at Bloomberg News for 9 years, and while I was there, I was writing about a bunch of topics, and one of them was climate change. The reason I got into climate adaptation was in January of 2016, the Obama administration announced the recipients of $1 billion in grant money under what was called the National Disaster Resilience Competition. And one of those grants awardees was a town in Louisiana that is trying to relocate further away from the water. And I went down to that town, as many journalists did, in the spring of 2016, and was struck by how, if you just thought about it for a second, it was not really a story about one little town in Louisiana. It was a story about the future of so many parts of the U.S. And we're only beginning to understand what those issues are. And what keeps me going is the fact that, unlike many other issues in the U.S., climate adaptation is not, I don't think, really politicized yet. It's not ideological. People are not fighting old battles based on pre-established lines of ideology. It's just too new. Unlike emissions, where Republicans and Democrats have been fighting over oil and gas companies for a long time, with resilience, there's no sort of inherent political position that says, yes, help people move or don't help them move. there's a degree of, if I can use the word innocence, it's so new that there really seems to be a desire by policymakers to help people. They don't know how yet. And so there's, I think, an inherent optimism in watching governments around the country really engage in good faith and try to protect their citizens, and then try to answer the question, okay, now we know we want to, but how do we do it? And that's
Yeah, I know I said I wasn't going to stay personal, but there's a really interesting question that just came in. What role do you think journalists play in shaping people's expectations about what a climate change future will look like? Are you conscious of this as you report and write about it?
Yeah, I'd like to think that we play an important role, because if nothing else, where journalists remain to some degree a gatekeeper of what is factual and accurate, but also a gatekeeper of what's important. And there's, climate change is such a hot topic. There's many different ideas and arguments. And I think journalists can play a useful role in helping people judge which debates are the most important, and also which position of those debates people should be aware of and understand. So there's a bit of a navigator role, right? Where you want to navigate through an avalanche of ideas and arguments and try and say which of these make sense enough to merit such that my readers need to know about it. And how can I make sure my readers get the cleanest, most accurate, fairest view of what's being argued about and what the relevant debates are. And that way, hopefully you can advance the debate just by helping you understand it. Because there's so much information out there and so much noise, that if all you do is help people find the most important stories, I think that helps.
Yeah. So back to a specific question. You mentioned bonds earlier. Do you see communities that aren't, say, Miami Beach, subject to profound flood risk / climate change, beginning to suffer in getting credit or ratings? And what happens then?
Yeah, it's a 100% great question. I wrote a story when I was at Bloomberg 3 years ago, I guess, maybe 4 years ago, looking at this question of rating agencies at the time still awarding top ratings, AAA ratings, to cities that had really severe climate threat, like may not exist in 30 years, still getting perfect credit ratings for 30-year bonds. So at the time, and I think this is still true, it's not obvious that cities that have significant climate risks are facing any reduction in their ability to access the credit market. That could change. And certainly Moody's and others have indicated that they're looking more and more carefully at climate risk and sort of how cities respond to climate risk. And if / when that does change, it'll be a huge deal. I don't think we're there yet. But yeah, I think at some point, if cities don't have the option of self-financing their climate resilience efforts, you'll have a real challenge for the federal government deciding who to help.
Yeah, so related here. Hi, Chris, enjoy your reporting a great deal. Do you think the city of Miami, Miami-Dade County, Miami Beach, all having a shared proximity of risk, but very little channels to coordinate consensus, costs, or action is a parable for how many local governments will find this problem around the country?
Okay, I don't, it's not obvious to me that of all the problems that the local officials in Miami face, that coordination is one of them. My sense is, from what little information I have, that the county does a good job, coordinating information and risk analysis and planning. I think definitely coordination in general is going to be an issue. From what I can tell, it's not obvious to me that it's a major issue. I think the bigger issue is not how do you coordinate a response among different levels of government, though it's certainly going to require attention. I think it's more what are the right solutions and how do you pay for them and how do you get buy-in? So, I mean, like you could imagine scenarios where different jurisdictions that are adjacent have very different views, and that complicates action. But in general, I think that isn't the big problem.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Another question. I've been thinking about what seems to be one of the first huge adaptation efforts in our region, which is moving septic systems to sewer systems.
Yeah.
This will be very costly and very disruptive to daily life in Miami. I wonder if these types of stories will impact how adaptation occurs in other regions and how you consider this in your reporting.
Yeah, such a great issue. I wrote a story in 2018 that I was going to mention during the talk, but I didn't because I haven't written on it since. I don't know what has changed. But at the time I wrote the story, there were 90,000 some septic tanks in Miami-Dade, and county officials said, look, because of sea level rise, your groundwater level rises as seas rise, and the problem with septic tanks is as your groundwater rises, you need, I think, 2 feet of clearance between the bottom of the system and the top of the groundwater level. And as groundwater goes up, you eat away at that. So you don't have sort of appropriate levels of treatment. So you get half treated human waste going into the groundwater level. In theory, it's an easy fix. You just take out the septic tanks, put everyone on the main sewer. Number one, it's wicked. I think the number was in the billions to replace those to put those 90,000 some homes on the sewage line. But that isn't even the big problem. The big problem is, what do you do if you anticipate that some of those neighborhoods won't exist in 20 years or 30 years? And well, okay, so if you got a full program, maybe you just exclude those neighborhoods. But then you got to tell those neighborhoods, here's why we're excluding you, right? So it's an engineering problem layered on a money problem, layered on a politics problem. And you can see why there might be some pressure just to do nothing, right? Because for the moment, the water system can generally handle whatever bacteria comes into the groundwater level, the groundwater from those failing septic tanks. But it's not going to work forever, right? So at some point, the county has to say, what do we do with those 90,000 some septic tanks? Even if you can find the money, is it a good way to spend that money? It's such a morass. So yeah, definitely a tough issue.
Yep. So another tough issue. We have many tough issues in Miami, as you know. Has there been any investigation on rebuilding or renovating to code? I live on a street that has been flooded several times, and none of the houses have been lifted or changed to be less subject to flood. They just keep renovating them.
Yeah, so I think on paper, you're supposed to go up to current code if you've got 50% damage or worse. That, you know, what counts as that can be, there can be some wiggle room. In theory, FEMA does oversight to make sure that local officials are enforcing that. All I know about it is it's hard to nail down. So it could be the person who asked the question. It could be that the homes he or she is referring to did not face substantial damage such that they triggered that 50% threshold. And so by the rules were not required to renovate or elevate. But there's certainly parts of the country, Louisiana has been through this, where after disaster, that requirement to rebuild to code is not imposed. And it's often the case that it's not imposed because officials say, we can't hit these people who've been hit by flooding with even more costs. Let's let them rebuild how they want to. And so one of the challenges of federal resilience policy is it tends to kick in at the worst moments. So definitely there's an issue of compliance with getting people to rebuild to code when they have damage, but there's wiggle room, and some of that wiggle room is based on persuasive arguments about this is the wrong time to make someone's life even harder.
Right. Another question here. What is the most surprising thing you've learned while reporting on climate change?
I don't know if this counts as surprising, but it's certainly heartening. A big part of my job is talking to local officials around the country who are facing different manifestations of climate change threats. And a very, very consistent takeaway for me is whatever region of the country you're talking to, whatever level of official you're talking to, there is a real commitment to taking this seriously and making the right decisions. Like when you get away from the high level politics of this and you get down to the local and county officials who have to figure out solutions, they are earnest, they have integrity, they are talking about the choices in front of them in a meaningful way. I've been almost consistently impressed by the sort of caliber and approach of people dealing with this. So there's a vein in this country that says, people who work for government are not to be admired, and that idea is just disproven for me every story I write.
Mm-hmm. That's good to hear. I think one more question. I want to end on a fairly positive note here. Wouldn't an FDR type climate New Deal be a win-win for all of us?
Yeah, I mean, like, define FDR type climate New Deal and define win-win, right? Clearly something's gonna have to happen. We're gonna have to do more of this because the change is coming, and all government can control is what kind of change and how is it going to affect us. You can't stop this change, at least not for a long time. So should there be an FDR style climate New Deal? There probably is going to be, whether we think it's a good idea or not. I think the question is more, what does it look like? And do we do it fast enough? And are we aware of the trade-offs that we're making? And are we at least being honest about the limits of what we can accomplish? And I don't know if that's an optimistic or a pessimistic point to end on. It's not clear to me what the answer is.
Right. Well, you're very true to yourself. You started with questions and you ended with questions. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much. You've really shed light on a lot of very important issues here, and we all appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.